The Federal Reserve was not created illegally. It was not created on Christmas Eve. It was signed into law on December 23rd, a Tuesday, 2 days before Christmas, in a ceremony that took place in the afternoon while Congress was very much in session. And while senators were indeed absent during the final Senate vote, the tally of 43 to 25 held a clear majority regardless of who was or wasn't in the chamber, and quorum was formally established at the start of proceedings. The congressional record from that day shows the Vice President confirming 48 senators answered the roll call. A quorum was present. The vote was legitimate by every procedural standard then in force. The Senate began debate at 10 a.m. on December 23 and passed the bill at 2:30 p.m. Of the 27 votes not cast, there were 11 in favour and 12 against the bill. Even if all the absentee senators had voted, the currency bill would have passed easily. What the title is reaching toward, imperfectly, with details wrong but instinct not entirely off, is a set of real events that are strange enough on their own terms to not need fabrication. The Federal Reserve was born from a secret meeting on a private island. The men who drafted its blueprint travelled under false names and denied the meeting happened for 20 years. The bill that became law was presented to the public under different sponsorship than actually conceived it, precisely because the men who conceived it knew that if their involvement became known, it would never pass, and a complicated, century-long arguments about whether a privately managed central bank serves public interests or primarily the interests of the institutions that designed it remains genuinely unresolved. Those are the real facts. They are worth taking seriously, which means starting with what actually happened and why the country that produced the Federal Reserve was the kind of country that might reasonably have been expected to do something like this. The United States in the decades before 1913 had an unusually violent relationship with money. Between 1863 and 1913, 8 banking panics occurred in the money center of Manhattan. The panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907 spread throughout the nation. These were not minor disruptions. They were events in which banks failed in cascades. Credit vanished from the economy as if someone had pulled a drain plug. Businesses that could not meet payroll simply stopped operating, and ordinary people who had deposited their wages in institutions they trusted found that those institutions had evaporated. Before the creation of the Federal Reserve, major financial crises occurred in the United States in 1873, 1884, 1890, 1893, and 1907. The frequency is striking. A significant financial panic roughly every decade, each one demonstrating the same structural weakness. The American banking system had no mechanism for injecting liquidity into the system when panic struck, no lender of last resort, no central authority that could act to stop a local bank failure from becoming a national catastrophe. The Panic of 1907 was the precipitating event, and it illustrated the problem with a clarity that even its opponents found difficult to argue with. When the Copper Corner collapsed and Knickerbocker Trust went down, the contagion spread through New York's trust companies and then outward across the country. With the nation confronting another financial crisis in 1907, and the United States the only one of the world's major financial powers without a central bank, the nation was forced to turn to Wall Street. Finance mogul J.P. Morgan, who had bailed the government out of a financial crisis in 1895, organized private sector investments and lines of credit to stabilize the banking system amid its latest panic. Recognizing that the nation could not continue to rely on wealthy individuals to stem an economic and financial crisis, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act on May 30, 1908. J.P. Morgan was 70 years old when he effectively became the central bank of the United States for that crisis, locking frightened bankers in his private library and refusing to let them leave until they had pledged enough capital to stop the contagion. He succeeded. He was also the only man in the country who could have done it. Congress grasped immediately how absurd this was, that the stability of the national economy depended on the continued willingness of one private citizen to personally intervene, and set about creating the institutional mechanism that would mean such interventions would never again be necessary. What Congress created, however, was not simply a technical solution to a technical problem. It was the outcome of one of the most concentrated political struggles in American financial history, and at its center was a secret that its architects kept for 2 decades. In November 1910, 6 men, Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg, met at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets. Aldrich was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and one of the most powerful Republican politicians in the country. Andrew was an assistant secretary of the Treasury. Davison was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan. Vanderlip was the president of National City Bank of New York, the largest and most powerful private bank in the United States. Warburg was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company and one of the foremost banking theorists of the era, a man who had been writing and lobbying for central bank reform for years with a systematic rigor that the others relied on to give their instincts technical form. Aldrich knew their ties to Wall Street could arouse suspicion about their motives and threaten the bill's political passage, so he went to great lengths to keep the meeting secret, adopting the ruse of a duck hunting trip and instructing the men to come one at a time to a train terminal in New Jersey where they could board his private train car. Once aboard, the men used only first names to prevent the staff from learning their identities. They called themselves the First Name Club: Nelson, Harry, Frank, Paul, Piatt, and Arthur. They spent 9 days on the island drafting legislation. The plan they produced, the Aldrich Plan, was presented publicly in January 1911 as the work of the National Monetary Commission, a body that had been established by Congress specifically to study the problem of financial reform. What was not disclosed was where the actual drafting had occurred, or by whom. As Warburg said in 1930, even the fact that there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. In 1935, Vanderlip wrote, "I was as secretive indeed, as furtive as any conspirator." If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. This is not a conspiracy theorist's interpretation of what happened. It is the admission of one of the men who was there, writing in his own memoir, in his own words, explaining precisely why the meeting was kept secret. Because the men at Jekyll Island knew that if the American public understood that the nation's new central banking system had been designed in a private conclave by the heads of the largest Wall Street banks, under the direction of a senator who was the father-in-law of a Rockefeller, the bill would fail. The participants themselves denied the meeting had occurred for 20 years until Andrew Vanderlip and Warburg shared the story with Aldrich biographer in 1930, 20 years of denial. The impetus for finally admitting it was the publication of a memoir by Carter Glass, the Virginia congressman whose name was on the final bill, in which Glass claimed all the credit for the ideas in the Federal Reserve Act. After that, the other people who contributed, particularly the Jekyll Island participants, came out with books and articles to talk about their role in creating the Aldrich Plan. The political history of the transition from the secret Aldrich Plan to the Public Federal Reserve Act is itself a study in strategic reinvention. The Aldrich Plan was proposed under a Republican administration in 1912, and it faced immediate Democratic opposition on the grounds that it gave too much power to private bankers. Aldrich's proposal was attacked by committees in both chambers for giving too little control to the government and too much power to bankers, especially those who ran the largest institutions. Then the Democrats won the White House and both houses of Congress in 1912, and the politics shifted entirely. The substance of the bill needed to stay largely the same, because the technical problems it was solving were real, but the bill needed new sponsors, new names attached to it, and a different ideological framing. Despite the delay in numerous drafts, the structure of the Federal Reserve, as passed overwhelmingly in December 1913, was virtually the same as the bill that emerged from the secret Jekyll Island meeting 3 years earlier. The final bill was shepherded by Carter Glass in the House and Robert Owen in the Senate, both Democrats, both presenting it as a progressive reform that would wrest monetary power from the Wall Street monopoly. Its most important political champion was William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, the great commoner, the man who had spent his career arguing that the gold standard and Eastern banking interests were strangling the ordinary American. Bryan's endorsement was critical to Wilson's willingness to push the bill. The structure of the Fed was a compromise between the desire of the bankers for a central bank under their control and the desire of President Woodrow Wilson to create a decentralized structure under public control. Bryan got an elected board of governors. The bankers got the 12 regional reserve banks, controlled primarily by their member institutions. Paul Warburg, who had designed the original system at Jekyll Island, later compared the Aldrich Bill and the Glass-Owen Bill clause by clause and demonstrated their essential identity. He was understandably proud of the continuity. Congress was as eager as a small boy to get off for the holidays, and there stood the cruel resolution of the Democratic majority not to adjourn unless the bill was passed. This undoubtedly had the effect of hastening final action. The drawing near of the gracious Christmastide seemed to calm the savage breast of the filibuster and to still the passions of the makers of long speeches. It was rumoured that Senator La Follette would insist upon speaking for 2 or 3 days, and one can imagine the apprehensive looks that were cast in his direction, but he let his music die within him. Even he could hardly have faced the universal rage that would have fallen upon him if he had ruined the congressional vacation over the holidays. This is not a description of a cabal operating in the dead of night. It is a contemporary newspaper's gentle mockery of the very ordinary political dynamics of a Congress that wanted to go home for Christmas. The bill passed in daylight with a quorum confirmed after months of hearings and debate. The House of Representatives approved the bill in a vote of 298-60 on December 22, 1913. The United States Senate followed in a vote of 43-25 on December 23, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law on December 23, 1913. The Senate vote was not at night. It was not on Christmas Eve. It was not conducted without a quorum. The senators who were absent had mostly left for the holiday, but their absence was not manufactured by their opponents. Many of the missing senators had already indicated their positions and were recorded in the Congressional Record. In both chambers of Congress, it was the anti-banker Democrats that overwhelmingly supported the act, while for the most part the pro-banker Republicans opposed it. This was not, in other words, a banker-controlled government steamrolling a suspicious public into accepting a privately designed central bank. It was a Democratic majority passing legislation that its constituents largely supported over the objections of the Republican Party that represented the banking establishment. The conspiracy theory and the historical reality are, in a strange way, mirror images of each other. The conspiracy theory says the Federal Reserve was created by bankers in secret and passed through a hijacked Congress while its opponents were away. The historical reality says the Federal Reserve was conceived by bankers in secret under false names on a private island and then repackaged as a progressive democratic reform so that the opponents of banker power would vote for it instead of against it. The actual deception was more sophisticated and more interesting than the one in the title. What was hidden was not the vote. What was hidden was the authorship. The men who built the Federal Reserve understood with perfect clarity that the American people would not accept a central banking system designed by the people most invested in its specific design. So they made sure it appeared to have been designed by their opponents. The secrecy at Jekyll Island was not about the vote in the Senate on December 23rd. It was about the 10 days in November 1910 when the actual architecture was drawn up. By the time the vote came, the concealment had already done its work for 3 years. The covert nature of the Jekyll Island meeting was so well guarded that even when Forbes mentioned it in 1917, it largely went unnoticed or was dismissed as fiction. The participants themselves vehemently denied the meeting for 2 decades, only acknowledging it following the publication of Aldrich's biography in 1930. What remains genuinely contested is not the legality of the passage, but the more fundamental question of what the Federal Reserve actually is and whom it actually serves. It is simultaneously a creature of Congress, subject to the oversight of elected officials, its governors confirmed by the Senate, and an institution whose founding architects were the presidents of the largest private banks in the country, who travelled under assumed names to a private island to ensure that no outsider would know they had designed it, because they were quite certain that knowledge would doom it. When the Federal Reserve celebrated its centennial in December 2013, it bore only passing resemblance to the institution created by Democrats, progressives, and populists just a century before. The Board of Governors that Brian fought for became, over decades of amendment and precedent, something quite different from the democratically accountable body he imagined. The regional banks that were supposed to balance power across the country became, in practice, dominated by the New York Fed, whose first president was Benjamin Strong, a man who had been at Jekyll Island. The three senators who were not told, in the title of this piece, do not exist as a specific documented group, but the spirit of the claim touches something real. There was something that the architects of the Federal Reserve did not tell Congress, or the public, or the senators who voted for it, and that something was precisely where the bill had come from, and whose interests had shaped its structure in the most fundamental way. The vote was legal, the secrecy was real. Those two things can coexist, and in the case of the Federal Reserve, they have coexisted for more than a century.